An Irrational Hatred of Luton, a West Ham fan's story by Robert Banks. Forward by Tony Cottee. Over to you, Tony.
I was very pleased and honoured to be asked to write the foreword to this book by Robert Banks. Anyone who has visited Upton Park, the home of West Ham United FC, would very quickly appreciate the wit and the humour that is associated with this famous East End club. It is a special family club that has had many ups and downs over the last 20 years. As a supporter since 1965 and then a player since 1983, I've been involved personally with many of the events that Robert described so well. It's a fascinating account seen purely through the eyes of an avid Hammers fan. I thoroughly enjoyed reliving some of the games from the past, and I'm sure too will all the fans who read it. Tony Cottee, Hornchurch, September 1995.
Chapter 1. Que Sera Sera. West Ham United 2, Fulham 0. 3rd of May 1975. FA Cup Final. When I was just a little boy, I asked my mother, "What will it be? Will it be Arsenal? Will it be Spurs?" Here's what she said to me. "Shut up and eat your dinner." Well, it wasn't quite like that. It would be tempting to relay wonderful stories of being taken along to the 1975 Cup Final by my father, a fellow long-suffering West Ham supporter, and that at the tender age of 6 I became smitten with the boys in claret and blue. It wasn't like that at all, and I can't change those facts even for the purposes of a book. Dad wasn't a West Ham fan, and I didn't go to the 1975 Cup Final. As hard as I try, I cannot conjure up wonderful memories of the year. In fact, I hardly remember anything about 1975, but then I was only 6 years old. The Bay City Rollers were quite big. Their flares and platform heels were even bigger. Mud were at number 1 with the old Buddy Holly song, "Oh Boy." Nothing new even then. My sister Sylvia was at that age, 14 or so, when she was starting to cause us all headaches. My parents, because she would go out until all hours, up to 10 o'clock at some stages, can you believe that? And for me and my eldest sister Lynn, because we were always in the room when Dad shouted at her. Despite generally hazy memories of the time, I clearly remember the 1975 Cup Final. It made an indelible mark on my life, mainly of course because as a direct result I ended up supporting West Ham United. This was in the days before I developed a sense of wanting the underdog to win. Had I been a few years older, I might well be a Fulham supporter today. I don't come from the East End. My family doesn't hail from the East End. My father's family have their roots in Hertfordshire, and my mother's family have always been in the Beckenham area of Kent. If place of birth dictates your football team, I ought to support Crystal Palace or Watford. The reason, purely and simply, that I began to support West Ham was because I liked the colour of their jerseys. 1975 was a bad year for disasters. The Moorgate tube crash claimed 34 lives and gave me nightmares. The people of Britain voted to stay in the common market. There was to be no greater fix in English history until Manchester United was seeded for the 1994 European Cup. Inflation hit 25%. Remember that? No, neither do I. But I wouldn't like to see it again, thank you. I do remember Mum buying a packet of cornflakes that had 6 different labels on it because the price went up at least once a week. Nostalgia is okay, but it wasn't all great music and cheap beer. Dutch elm disease took hold, and worse than all the above put together, I started supporting West Ham United. You might think that liking claret and blue as a colour combination is a pretty feeble reason for supporting a football team, but when you're 6 years old, it's good enough for anybody. That Saturday afternoon, Sylvia had sneaked out to see one of her boyfriends. I think Lynn was probably studying away upstairs for some exams. I'd been out during the morning for a quarter of lemon bonbons and a copy of Buster. That's the comic, not the film starring Phil Collins. This was the Saturday ritual. I had 30p pocket money, and this is largely what it was spent on. The room being empty, just me and Dad, we settled down to watch the match. "Who do you want to win, son?" he probably said. Forgive me if I forget the exact dialogue, but I'd not yet developed my photographic memory. West Ham." "Why?" he undoubtedly said. Not sure. Just do," I possibly said. "Me too," he might have said. Why? I probably didn't say, because I've never been that curious about anything. However, it's convenient for the opening chapter of this book. Oh, I've got a mate who supports them, Bob Morey. I think he's gone along today. Watch closely, you might see him. Apart from the fact I had no idea what Bob Morey looked like, and the fact that he wasn't actually there, I thought I stood a pretty good chance of seeing him in the 100,000 crowd. Bob Morey had a lot to answer for. It was he, along with Dad, who took me to my first game at Upton Park, then cunningly sloped off into the background, never mentioning West Ham again until he phoned me out of the blue in 1994, wanting my membership number to get tickets for the last game of the season. He was like the drug pusher giving away the first fix to get you hooked, except he then disappeared and left me scratching at the floor. It was he who got me well and truly smitten, and he who holds the real blame. If Dad had said, "Why not support Fulham today?" things might have been so different. I was always keen to please Dad, but when it came to cup finals we generally supported opposite sides to make life interesting. This, apart from the 1980 cup final, was the only time we agreed on the same team. The more observant reader will by now have ascertained that my father was not an ardent West Ham fan at the time. He has since been converted, but it has been a long and painful process. He supported Crystal Palace passively, and would often relate to me tales of how he used to sell programmes at Selhurst Park in the days when the team wore black and white and they were nicknamed the Glaziers after the famous Palace of Glass. He said that even in those days they used to call Millwall fans the Bottle Boys because they always brought a bottle or two to throw when things got a bit boring. At Palace, of course, this happened quite frequently. I contented myself with my lemon bonbons and a mug of tea and watched the game. Dad always encouraged me to watch football right from an early age, and there came the other link with West Ham. It must have been shortly before the West Ham Cup final victory that England played Scotland at Wembley in the home internationals. Trevor Brooking had a blinding game, and Dad always singled him out as the best player on the pitch. "He's got 2 feet," he would say. "All the best players in the world have got 2 feet." Being young and not fully aware, I thought all players had 2 feet, otherwise they tended to fall over. This, I later learned, was not the case. Fortunately, I was still too young to have developed my cynical and smutty sense of humour, and I did not snigger to myself and say, "He's got 2 feet, how does he get it in his shorts? No wonder he runs a bit crooked." As I recall, the game itself was David Coleman's commentary on the BBC. We always watched the cup final on the BBC, always, no exceptions. In 1975 and right up to 1986, the cup final was shown live on both ITV and BBC. Dad always chose BBC. Coleman's voice puzzled me. He sounded confused and behind the action. He sounded as though he was about to burst into tears or have a nervous breakdown. I can't claim to remember what he said, but his tone of voice will remain with me forever. I can't claim to remember much about the game either. The video sits proudly on the shelf at home and gets the occasional airing. Second half goals from Alan Taylor brought the cup to Upton Park, and I celebrated by having another lemon bonbon. When you become enthralled by something at the age of 6, there is very little anyone can say or do to make you change your mind. You will always be secretly fascinated by it or them. It was at this stage in my tender beginnings that I also met the wonderful Helen. Not the 3rd of May 1975, but around that time. The skinny little blonde girl with pigtails and a holier-than-thou attitude was to fascinate me and frustrate me for the next 5 years, until she left me for another school. She resurfaced again quite by chance in 1991. The pigtails had gone, but the fascination remained as she continued to look down her pretty little nose at me. It was terminal, far too late to be reclaimed. As I recall those early days, my own version of the Doris Day song reverberates around my head. I wrote it specifically about my feelings towards the wonderful Helen and the not quite so wonderful West Ham United. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. You're doomed for eternity. Que sera, sera. Chapter 2. Forever and Ever. Anderlecht 4, West Ham United 2, 5th of May 1976. European Cup Winners' Cup Final. 1 year on. The football season came and went, and West Ham managed a highly disappointing 18th place. As cup winners the previous year, hopes were high of another good cup run, but a third round draw at home to Liverpool put paid to that. In the fourth round of the League Cup, West Ham drew 0-0 at White Hart Lane, earning a replay. If you can imagine 38,443 people inside Upton Park, then you were probably there. Spurs won 2-0 after extra time. Even a two-legged Anglo-Italian Cup Winners' tournament against Fiorentina ended in failure. It was a typical season of highs and lows, raised hopes and unfulfilled promises. I had a very happy life around this time. Shortly after the 1975 Cup final, I celebrated my 7th birthday. 7 is a nice age to be. You don't have the pressures of being a teenager or an adolescent, and yet you're fully able to communicate and remember. Some people say being a baby is the best time of your life, but I disagree. Who wants to be mollycoddled with no right of reply, no ability to do anything except cry, puke and sit in your own poo? No thanks. At this time I was at Balgowan Infant School in Beckenham. What a great life. You went to school about 9, mucked about with crayons and paint, not to mention the sandpit, and got to play football 3 times a day with a ropey old tennis ball before being collected by your mother and taken home for tea at 3:30. Only building site workers and quantity surveyors are afforded such luxury in adult life. The football in the playground took on a magical importance. Each of us pretended to be our favourite player, and it's no use any of you reading this saying, "I never used to do that." If you played, you did it. In my case, I made my only deviation from the West Ham faith and used to pretend to be Gordon Hill, the former Manchester United and Derby County winger. Except that unlike Gordon, I didn't leave defenders trailing in my wake with the ball still miraculously glued to my feet. More often than not, I used to try and play a 1-2 off a concrete flower tub and would end up in the flower tub with the ball nowhere to be seen. My best friend was Neil Dobson. He supported West Ham or Aston Villa. He wasn't quite sure because he couldn't tell the difference. Even at the age of 7, he was a bright footballer and everybody wanted to have him on their team. Of course, he later went on to play for the school, the county, and had trials with Leyton Orient, before tragically having to quit at the age of 25 after surviving a brain hemorrhage suffered while working in Germany. Throughout our teenage years, we went to Upton Park together, but at this stage of our lives, he had to endure constant ribbings about his mum looking like the Queen and the fact that his handwriting was so neat. He sent me a Christmas card in 1976 which said, "Happy Christmas, Robert. I hope you get better at football." This was his way of being nice, and I accepted that, along with the fact I would probably never be good enough to play for Balgowan Juniors, let alone West Ham United and England. After many brief encounters with concrete flower tubs, I decided to try and work on my game. Saturday afternoons were spent in the garden, kicking a ball against the wall, trying to control it with my left foot and kick it with my right, then vice versa. At about 4:40 the shout would come from the back room, "Results!" I would rush in and sit down in front of the TV. Again, it was always the BBC and their teleprinter, rather than Dickie Davis and his magic hairstyle on ITV's World of Sport. I think this was purely because Dad wanted to avoid the wrestling at all costs. Also, there was a kind of manic anticipation about watching the results come up letter by letter, a sadistic pleasure for a West Ham fan. Throughout the winter of 1975-76, the results came in, some of which weren't too bad. Stoke 1, West Ham 2, the printer flashed. West Ham 0, Liverpool 4, it flashed again. West Ham 0, Everton 1, it flashed on April the 24th, and the season was over. As I only generally saw the results on a Saturday, I had somehow managed to miss out on the fact that we'd reached the final of the European Cup Winners' Cup. I feel very bitter about this because as a fan, you want to be involved in these things, and I missed out because I was asleep. Looking back at the videos and the programmes, it must have been great to see us pull back such deficits against European clubs on winter nights at Upton Park, particularly the quarter-final against Den Haag of Holland, in which West Ham trailed 2-4 from the first leg, but won the second 3-1 to go through on away goals. Similarly, the semi-final against Eintracht Frankfurt produced a 2-1 defeat in the first leg in Germany, but a brilliant performance at home to win 3-1. I do remember the final, or the night of the final, quite well. It was played in Anderlecht's Heysel Stadium in Brussels, a fact which I thought was rather unfair, as Anderlecht were the opposition. Dad pointed out the stadium to hold the final was picked before the tournament began, and there was no fiddling involved. Also, he had said that West Ham got to the final before in 1965 and played at Wembley, which was almost home advantage. Two vivid memories remain from the night. The first was West Ham's disgusting new strip. Fortunately, it was modified slightly for the next season, but it was an Admiral strip with a blue yoke and huge collars with Admiral badges on. The West Ham badge was right in the centre. I thought it looked truly awful. The second was the unfairness of it all. Anderlecht were by far the better side, and despite going 1-0 up, we really didn't stand a chance. Dutch World Cup stars Robbie Rensenbrink and Arie Haan were on top form, as Francois van der Elst, later to join West Ham, rounded Mervyn Day to slot home the fourth. I think it was Coleman again who shouted, 4-2! It was only a few years later that I learned that the West Ham side had nearly all been suffering from bad upset stomachs and played on through considerable discomfort. The match enhanced my now growing sense of support for the underdog. Why should it be that Anderlecht should have home advantage and better players? Come on, West Ham, you show them. It was an instinct, which had floundered only a week earlier when I'd staked my reputation as football expert at school on the line by declaring that Manchester United would beat Southampton in the FA Cup final by 8-0. No one seemed to disagree with me, so I was particularly upset when Bobby Offside Stokes slammed the winner past Alex Stepney. I was sure that if Gordon Hill hadn't been substituted, United would have won by 8. It's very strange, but if Manchester United were playing Southampton in the cup final today, I know who I'd be rooting for. Having established my faith in the underdog, West Ham United were now my team. The years that followed immediately after the Cup Winners' Cup defeat in Brussels were highly unproductive and ended in relegation in 1978. For 2 years we were underdog to everybody, even in cup matches. Just as I was underdog to Stephen Scott for the affections of the wonderful Helen, I began to realise that this was my role in life. Now that Helen saw me as nothing more than a football hooligan, she went off with Stephen Scott, who had a new bike, a big tree house, and could burp the tune of God Save the Queen. Like West Ham at Heysel, I didn't stand a chance. The long hot summer came, and I found myself drawn away from football and into music. My tearaway sister had developed her own version of headbanging called rocking. This usually took the form of sitting in an armchair, putting a record on very loud and hitting your head against the back of the chair in time to the music. It had to be music that could be rocked to. Anything by Mud, Sweet, the Rubettes or Alvin Stardust was generally acceptable, as was Crocodile Rock by Elton John. I'm sure that rocking made me the man I am today. It gave one a terrific sense of well-being. After a session of rocking, you could stand up and find that you were too dizzy to walk. An early form of intoxication, which invariably had no more damaging side effect than a sore head. That year, a record by Slick made number 1, which couldn't be rocked to, but it was still played over and over again until the record wore out. It had bells and a church organ and sounded a bit of a dirge, but it was appropriate. Maybe not immediately, but certainly for my future with West Ham. I dedicate to you all my love, my whole life through. I'll love you forever and ever. Chapter 3. You're the one that I want. West Ham United 3, Chelsea 1, 25th of March 1978. In the same way one remembers losing their virginity, it ought to be with a glow of thrilling reflection that one remembers their first live football match. For me it was a strange experience, and one which, irritatingly, considering my ability to recall most useless information, has largely slipped from my memory. Bob Morey lived somewhere down in the very bowels of the Kent countryside, and had to make very deliberate efforts to attend a home game. When Dad told him I was showing an interest, he made the mistake of saying, "We must take him to a game sometime then." This didn't happen for a long time, and despite the efforts of a neighbour, Mr. Chidley, to get me to support Palace and go along to see them with him, it was almost 3 years from my initial fascination taking root that I finally managed to see a game at Upton Park. I always feel guilty about Mr. Chidley though. He stopped me and my sister in the street one Saturday and asked me if I wanted to go and see Crystal Palace against Chelsea that afternoon. I rudely replied that I'd get a better view on the box. a fact that my dear sister lost no time in telling my mother. It was the only time I've seen her really angry. She apologised to Mr. Chidley for my behaviour, but I still didn't really see what I'd done wrong. After all, seeing Crystal Palace live was probably going to be about as exciting as a day's shopping in Bolton, with less to show for it at the end. Watching it with Mr. Chidley would double the boredom, and I didn't think my mother would be too keen on the idea anyway. It turned out I was right, but she was upset that I'd been so rude. My sister had no doubt embellished the story with a few carefully chosen adjectives, which added to the severity of my sentence. "Does that mean I have to go with him then?" I asked as I was packed off to go and apologise. "No, of course not," Mum said. "I wouldn't force you to go anywhere you didn't want to." This was a lie. She forced me to go to my sister's wedding in 1984 when West Ham were at home to Aston Villa. My mother would have made a good referee. No consistency. I got a red card and an early bath for rudeness, yet only a yellow and a talking to for pinching soft bread from the middle of the loaf, forcing Dad to have holy sandwiches. My guilt piled up over a number of years, and I decided to take Mr. Chidley to a game one day, only to find he was ill in hospital. He died of cancer a few days later, and while I never regretted not going to see Crystal Palace against Chelsea, it taught me to be polite when rejecting offers. A lesson a few women I know might like to heed. March 25th, 1978 was Easter Saturday. It was the day of the boat race, one that Cambridge will want to forget. Not only did they lose, they sank. Pocket money by now had gone up to 50p a week. Well, that was a Labour government for you. Inflation was rife and I had trouble keeping pace. I tried to get it index linked, but Dad was having none of it. I don't know how much a quarter of lemon bonbons was, but it must have burned a substantial hole in my weekly income. Dad said that he and Bob Morey were going to Upton Park to watch West Ham against Chelsea, and did I want to go? I remember thinking, "You're going where? You're asking me what?" Perhaps he thought he might get a Mr. Chidley type reaction, but I leapt at the chance, and Bob Morey arrived from his Kentish home in time for us to get the train to London. It was a tortuous journey. We took a train to Victoria and then the District line all the way to Upton Park. I knew no better then, blindly followed, but travel always seemed to take twice as long when you're 9. Of course, we know a much more direct route by public transport now. It's like that Billy Bonds interview, or any interview with a player who's been to Wembley on more than one occasion. They always say, you let it all go by you on the first occasion. On the second visit, you take it all in and take notice of things. Remember them, savour them. I always thought this was a bit daft. I mean, after all, these are grown men. Surely they can remember the day. But now when I think of this significant event in my life, I really remember very little about it, except the smell of the horse manure, the big crowd, and the noise they made every time a goal was scored. On this occasion it happened 3 times, although I have to quickly refer to a book to see that Trevor Brooking, Bill Green and Patsy Holland scored West Ham's goals after Bill Garner had put Chelsea ahead. All I vividly recall was that the Chelsea goalkeeper took a bad knock and the spindly frame of Tommy Langley took over in goal. I also remember walking away from the game disappointed I hadn't seen Pop Robson score a goal. Brian Pop Robson was a bit of a cult figure to me. This small, balding man seemed to be able to run rings around defences, and they were always very keen on showing his goals on the big match on a Sunday afternoon when we settled down after our roast dinner, followed by peaches and custard and too much cream soda. Looking back, it seems that West Ham were nearly always on the big match, but I'm sure that wasn't the case. It helped that the big match was run by London Weekend Television rather than a national organisation like the BBC, and that we were the top London club in the second division for almost as long as we were down there. Crystal Palace stole our thunder in 1980, but then we had the cup run to make up for it. Just as we now think that John Motson is a Manchester United supporter, I was convinced in those days that Brian Moore was a West Ham fan. He always grinned with delight when talking about a win and looked sullen and sombre when describing a defeat. I almost expected him to refer to West Ham as we. Perhaps he liked us so much because he shared a hairdresser with Pop Robson. I could never work out why Robson was called Pop. I assumed it was down to some disagreeable personal habit he had, but later found out it was because he looked old enough to be everyone's dad. Why then does every player by the name of Robson seem to be called Pop? I heard Ron Atkinson refer to the other Brian Robson, the crap one who played for England a few times, by that name the other day, and it made me cringe. There was only one Pop. Some of the goals he scored were unbelievable, and he'd run all day for the team. He was in his second spell at West Ham when I saw him play, and unlike Frank McAvenny a few years later, he seemed able to recapture the form that had made him a hero in the first place. It occurred to me that this was what I wanted. This was the way I wanted to spend my Saturday afternoons, up to my neck in horse manure, beef burgers, peanuts and Coke. It was simple in those days. You could pay on the door and get in without too much bother. There was no sponsorship. Our most expensive player was David Cross, who had cost 2 weeks' pocket money and a packet of crisps from West Bromwich Albion. And yet I didn't go to another game for just over 5 years. I'm always galled by this fact, as it was second only to the mid-60s period as the most successful in the club's history. With the FA Cup in 1980, promotion and a League Cup final in 1981, and a healthy start back in the top flight. A number of things stopped me going back for more after my initiation. Firstly, my parents were reluctant to allow me to go to football in the first place. This was an attitude I couldn't understand at the time. Now, though, I can see their point of view. I certainly wouldn't let a 9-year-old son of mine go to football alone or with his mates. Dad wasn't keen on live football after so many years of armchair support, and while Bob Morey would have been able to take me, he now went even less frequently due to the arrival of children in his life. Mr. Chidley wouldn't go to Upton Park unless Crystal Palace were playing, and I wasn't allowed to go alone with my friends. My parents were almost successful in weaning me off my childhood addiction, but it came back to me in September 1983 in a big way. With the newfound freedom that earning a bit of extra money brings, I was able to make my own arrangements to go out on a Saturday afternoon or a Wednesday night. Meanwhile, the armchair support continued, in between impersonations of John Travolta and a deep and to this day lasting crush on Olivia Newton-John. Chapter 4. Revolution. Blackburn Rovers 1, West Ham United 0, 5th of May 1979. The boys were on a roll, downwards. It was difficult for me to keep in touch with this game, as I'd been on a week's holiday with the school at Butlins in Minehead of all places. I enjoyed the week, but never thought about going back to a holiday camp. They're full of people telling you what to do. You could get that at home a lot cheaper. This day was significant. Not only did it mark the end of a season ending like a damp squib, with a 0-0 draw at Cardiff and a 2-1 defeat at Millwall to follow, but this very day, 5th of May 1979, was one day after Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Again, the sense of wanting the underdog to win inspired me, and I was pleased to see she'd won. It seemed that she was the West Ham of the political world. No one gave her a chance, but she didn't care, and no woman had ever been Prime Minister before. Go on, Maggie, I thought. You show 'em. Politics meant nothing to me then. The long faces of the teachers that Saturday morning said it all. She's done it, they muttered to each other with a glazed expression. It was as though the button had been pressed and a nuclear holocaust was about to follow, as though they already knew that the national curriculum, public sector pay cuts and Baker days were already on the way. They looked shell-shocked. Their holiday was over in more ways than one. I thought it was brilliant. I couldn't understand why they were all so upset. From my uneducated and naive viewpoint, it seemed like a new broom was needed to sweep clean. We'd had one-day rail strikes, public employee strikes, lorry driver strikes. I hoped that Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't do too much about the lorry drivers just yet, as it meant that we could have days off in the winter when the central heating oil didn't arrive. The rubbish had piled up on the streets as the dustmen went on strike. Houses burnt down while the army tried to put fires out during the firemen's strike. The Yorkshire Ripper had killed his 11th victim. Surely Maggie would sort him out. She probably wouldn't have been able to do anything about the Welsh, though. They'd won the Rugby Union Triple Crown for the 3rd year in a row and were becoming boring. Someone, I can't recall who, had heard the football results on the coach and gloated. We had the most expensive goalkeeper in the world in £565,000 Phil Parks, but still it seemed we wouldn't win promotion. Remember this day, my Crystal Palace supporting teacher, Mr. Harper, told me. It will go down as one of the darkest days in English history. Come on, I replied, as only a precocious 10-year-old can. It was only 1-0. Chapter 5. I'm into something good. West Ham United 1, Arsenal 0, 10th of May 1980, FA Cup Final. In the 2 years that separated my first game at Upton Park and the team reaching the Cup Final for the second time in 6 years, many changes had taken place in the life of young Master Banks. How pleased I was my surname wasn't Bates. The vital importance of West Ham United was not so nagging. Like any addict separated from his drug for a prolonged period, the craving declines. This didn't stop me watching the results service at 4:40 p.m. on a Saturday and groaning at a poor result and whooping at a good one. It didn't stop me wearing that awful Admiral replica shirt during games of football in the park. Neil Dobson was still head and shoulders above everyone else as a player, but he didn't write comments in my Christmas card anymore, and this was partly due to the fact that I'd improved as a player, and partly because we did a display on the wall for Guy Fawkes Night, and Neil had been asked to write out the famous rhyme due to his superb handwriting. But he wrote, "Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, trees and in plot." We were quits after that. Neil still followed West Ham and was now able to distinguish them from Aston Villa due to our distinctive, if somewhat disgusting, new shirts. We were joined as fans by Paul Cole, a lad I identified with due to his similar diminutive stature. With both of us being small for our age, we had to stick together, and while the rest of the class supported Liverpool, Manchester United or Arsenal, we resolutely remained Hammers fans. In September 1979 we all moved up to the big school, Kelsey Park School for Boys, again in Beckenham. It was something of a culture shock to move from being the most senior pupils at a junior school to the lowest of the low at a comprehensive. Kelsey Park was a nightmare building, slung together in the early 70s. It had a capacity for about 1,000 boys. Its modern buildings were supplemented by mobile classrooms permanently anchored to the spot close to the playgrounds. The smell of those rooms remains with me today, a mixture of chalk, rubber and mud. Towards the end of the first year there was a buzz of expectation amongst the West Ham contingent, which had been added to by boys from other local schools: Derek Close Shave, Graham Lanky Holland, Lee Bishop, Dave Fat Sadler, Martin Barney Barnard and Neil Staintooth Daniels. By the quarter-final stages, small transistor radios found their way into the classrooms for the draw. Derek, or Close as he was rather unimaginatively known, was the first to spread the news that we'd been drawn at home to Aston Villa. Despite listening to the draw on the radio, it never occurred to any of us to listen to the game on the radio or try and track progress during the game. It was always the done thing to wait until 4:40 and watch the results as they popped up. I was allowed to wait up and watch our 1-0 win over Villa, which was shown on Match of the Day the same night. A rather dodgy penalty award, but calmly dispatched by Ray Stewart. 2 days later we got the draw we wanted, against Everton in the semi-final, to be played at Villa Park. The other semi was between Liverpool and Arsenal, and as well documented, went to 4 games before Arsenal finally came out on top. The game against Everton was played in glorious sunshine in our local park. It finished 14-3 to West Ham and Robert Banks scored a hat-trick. It was watched by an indifferent crowd of 3 people and 1 dog. Apart from the crowd, the location and the score and the teams, it could have been the very same game that had finished 1-1 at Villa Park. We all ran back to Paul's house after the game to hear the news and felt curiously deflated, despite the fact that Everton were a First Division side and that we had come back from a goal down. The replay was at Elland Road, Leeds, and again went to extra time. Bob Latchford's goal cancelled out Alan Devonshire's opener. Frank Lampard then scored with a brilliant diving header. He jogged across the penalty area and danced around the corner flag. We didn't get to see this marvellous goal until Football Focus the following Saturday, but it was worth the wait. West Ham were in the FA Cup final. Once the other semi had been decided, we knew we'd be playing Arsenal, and all the games in the park became West Ham against Arsenal in an attempt to try and predict the outcome. The smart money at school was on Arsenal, as they were in their third cup final in a row, and they were in the final of the Cup Winners' Cup as well. Paul came over to my house and watched the game with me and my dad. To put up token resistance, Dad said he wanted Arsenal to win, but I knew he really wanted West Ham. Not only was our team in the cup final, but our team was the underdog. Sheer heaven. I was worried about Mum and Dad. They knew very well I had an ambition to become a writer. Yet at no stage did they even attempt to get a divorce, throw things at each other, or beat me severely. Most people would say, "And a jolly good job, my son, but not for a writer. A writer needs to have a past, a history of strife, something to make him bitter and angry." My dad didn't even go to the pub on a Sunday and come home late for lunch. The most controversial thing he used to do was to comb his hair over the kitchen sink and leave all the bits in the washing up. Hardly a capital offence, is it? Their marriage wasn't without incident, but it never affected us kids. Therefore, when Cup Final Saturday came around, as one of the few occasions in the year when there was a bit of live footy on the box, Mum withdrew gracefully to bed, with a Daphne du Maurier and a crunchy bar, leaving the boys to watch the match on the telly undisturbed. Arsenal wore their yellow away kit on the 10th of May 1980, as they had done in the previous two cup finals. This was boring. Even more boring from my point of view was the fact that West Ham wore their all-white away kit. For me, part of the glamour of the cup final is the colour of the shirts, and for me yellow and white just didn't work. I accepted that one team had to wear an away strip, but if it had to be us, why couldn't Arsenal have worn their red shirts? I wasn't too upset that we didn't have to wear those rotten Admiral claret and blue shirts. The game itself got off to a flyer. I remember Pikey had a shot that fizzed across the goal, and Paul and I drew our breath sharply. Then Devonshire broke down the left, got to the byline and put in a cross which Pat Jennings could only palm onto Stuart Pearson, who slammed it back towards goal. A bit of pinball ensued, finally ending up with Trev's head, 1-0. I remember Stuart Pearson looked as though he's just given birth as he walked back to the centre circle. That was him gone for the rest of the game. West Ham battled on bravely to get the win. Who could ever forget little Paul Allen, at 17 years, still at the time of writing the youngest ever player to appear in an FA Cup final, ruthlessly pulled down by Willie Young when clean through. The fact that Allen stood about as much chance of scoring as Long John Silver was neither here nor there. That tackle effectively ruined Willie Young's career, as no one ever mentioned anything else, and all we got out of it was a free kick. Today, 5 players would have been sent off for that tackle. Allen, of course, went on to claim that he was, quote, happy to be a Hammer for life, unquote. I have that press cutting to prove it. Moments later, he signed for Spurs. Judas! Naturally, the day ended in high celebration. Paul and I went out on our bikes to buy a celebratory round of sweets. As we left the shop, he grabbed 2 Texan bars from the shelf and stuffed them under his shirt. He grinned as he handed one of them to me outside, and I accepted it with doubtful gratitude. Why had he done that? I was confused. From the highest of highs, I was cast into a pit of uncertainty. Dad always said if he caught me stealing, he'd thrash me to within an inch of my life, a threat which I always took great care to heed. Was I really into something good? Chapter 6. Imagine. Blackburn Rovers 0, West Ham United 0, 13th of December 1980. December the 9th, 1980 will be etched on my memory forever. It was a Tuesday. I know that without referring to any old diaries or school books. On December the 9th, 1980, one of my heroes died. Mr. Clark, our maths teacher, who I liked and respected despite the fact he was a Villa fan, was late for double maths. Obviously we didn't actually care about that fact, but he walked into the room with a tear in his eye that morning. The classroom was silent so quickly it was as though a plug had been pulled out. "Boys," he said, his voice trembling, "I'm sorry I'm late. I've just heard about John Lennon." To most of the boys in the room this meant nothing. They, like me, were about 18 months old when the Beatles split up, and if it wasn't anything to do with Duran Duran or OMD, then it didn't really matter. I had quote, different, unquote, tastes in music, and Beatles records were good records to rock to, as my sister and I had experimented with Magical Mystery Tour, and I loved the music of the Beatles. At the age of 10, I first heard Rubber Soul, and felt that if I was only ever able to own one album, this would be it. "Sir," I ventured. "Yes?" He looked up from the floor. "What have you heard about John Lennon?" A snigger came from the back of the room. "He's dead. He's been shot. Murdered. Now then, quadrilateral equations." I couldn't believe it. For the first time I'd heard about someone dying and it hurt me. Not just an, "oh well, that's a shame, still he had a good innings," reserved for family funerals. This was a tragedy. An amazing talent swiped from us at the age of 40. I stopped at my friend's house on the way home, as I always did. His mum gave us a glass of milk and a Kit Kat to help us along until tea time. Suburban life doesn't get any more exciting than that, I'm afraid. "Have you heard about John Leonard?" said Lanky's mum. I was angry that someone old enough to remember him, and who probably bought Beatles records when they first came out, should get his name wrong. I wanted to say, "It was Lennon, you fool," but all I said was yes. I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know if she would have approved of him. After all, he took drugs and stuff once. "Still, I don't suppose he means a great deal to you, does he?" His attitude always made my blood boil. It was the first of many occasions which forced me to believe I was actually meant to have been born in 1958 and not 68. Had that been the case, I would have been old enough to remember West Ham winning the Cup in 64, and the Cup Winners' Cup in 65, and the World Cup in 66. If you support another club and you're reading this now is the time to throw your hands up in horror and say, "It wasn't just Hurst, Moore and Peters, you know." Well, for your information, it bloody well was, okay? I would have been able to buy a copy of Rubber Soul when it first came out, not 13 years later, and I would have been able to marry Diana Hopkins when the opportunity presented itself. I would have been able to sympathise with the rest of the mourners at the passing of Lennon and say, "I remember him." It's not as daft as it sounds. Mum did have a child in 1958. It was stillborn. Should have been me. I inherited the soul. I had the body of a 27-year-old, but the mind 10 years older. What has all this got to do with West Ham sharing out a goalless draw at Ewood Park, I hear you cry? Well, very little, except that on the evening of Lennon's death they showed the film Help as a tribute. Dad got annoyed because they shifted his favourite programme to accommodate it. After the film I went upstairs and decided to keep a diary. I put Imagine on the record player and began to write. That was the first entry. The second entry came the following Saturday and read, "West Ham drew 0-0 at Blackburn. I'm upset about John Lennon, but I really think West Ham are going to win promotion this season." That was the last entry for nearly 4 years. I was right though. West Ham did win promotion and got 2 trips to Wembley that season as well. Both were against Liverpool. First was in the Charity Shield, which we lost, and the second, the League Cup final. I was really pissed off about the League Cup final because Neil Dobson's dad had got 2 tickets and the greedy sod took one for himself, honestly. The match took place on a Saturday afternoon before the days of sponsorship and Sunday afternoon TV. The highlights were shown on the Sunday Match of the Day special. A dull 0-0 draw was brought to life in extra time when Alan Kennedy scored for Liverpool. The goal was allowed despite Sammy Offside Lee, no relation to Bobby Offside Stokes, lying in the 6-yard area and moving his head out of the way to allow the ball into the net. Not interfering with play? Yeah, right, my granny played centre-half at Bolton. With a minute to go, Terry McDermott handled an Alvin Martin header on the line and Ray Stewart converted the penalty. A 1-1 draw, but we held the moral high ground, being a second division club and having conceded a highly dodgy goal. Highly dodgy. The replay was the next Wednesday and was shown live on ITV from Villa Park. At last we got to wear claret and blue in a major final, even if it wasn't at Wembley. Our shiny new Adidas strip actually looked the business. Goddard scored and I hit my head on the wall. We had enjoyed so much success in recent months, I was sure we would hold on. Of course it all went belly up. Was that a Bond's own goal? Liverpool credit it to Alan Hansen, but I know who got the last touch. I was so upset I took the next 2 days off school pretending to be ill. At least promotion was still on. Dobbo didn't even get me a programme for the Wembley game, the miserable git. Paul's behaviour was beginning to worry me. He was a good mate to have at the age of 12. He had an Australian mum who was a midwife and used to keep all sorts of weird things belonging to other women in the freezer. His dad was the funniest man I'd ever met, a real wag. They owned a big house which had been extended upwards to make it even bigger, and Paul knew all the best places to go on our bikes after school. We made a hideout at nearby Harvington Woods, which had a small river and a V2 crater, ideal for mucking about in and generally getting up to no good. He had a brilliant collection of mucky books which his older brother had given to him, and to top it all, he had a snooker table. All in all, he was a good mate, but he was starting to steal things. By now, he was nicking anything that wasn't bolted down, starting with sweets from the tuck shop at school and rapidly graduating to library books, chairs, desks and computers. It was only a matter of time before he moved on to cars. He would have stolen the burning sun in the open sky given the chance. The thought of stealing things never really appealed to me, and I therefore decided to back away from Paul gradually, as I knew that one false move would see me strung up from the highest yardarm. I'm just one of those people. If I let the tax disc on my car go one day overdue, I get a fine, whereas the neighbour has had 3 cars untaxed in the road since last July. I'm not bitter about this, at least I know where I stand. Paul had to go. He was moving into the expensive clothing market, and 3 Pringles and 2 pairs of Farrahs later he was caught. Still, I told him when I bumped into him in a pub, at least West Ham got promotion. Can you imagine what a bummer of a year it would have been otherwise? Yes, he said bitterly, I can imagine. That period was a real up and down affair. We won the cup and lost the cup. I lost John Lennon. I lost Paul. Both Stephen Scott and I lost the wonderful Helen. Helen always said she hated me, but I knew deep down she loved me. She tried to make me jealous by going out with Stephen Scott, but it didn't work. Well, not on the surface anyway. I tried to make her jealous by going out with Jennifer Cousins. That worked superbly, but Helen managed to hide it very well. In the end, obviously ripped apart by her love for me, she persuaded her parents to move to Hartley, and I didn't see her again for 11 years. Imagine that. Chapter 7. I Believe. Tottenham Hotspur 0, West Ham United 4, 2nd of September 1981. We made it. Back in the top flight, but I still felt strangely removed from the success. Not so strange really, when you consider that having set myself up as a loyal supporter, devoted to the cause, I hadn't attended a game for over 3 years. I was starting to get a little bit of grief from the Spurs contingent at school. At the end of the previous season, they had won the FA Cup, beating Manchester City 3-2 in a memorable replay at Wembley, thus starting a period of 3 successive FA Cup finals to be decided by replays. Spurs were cock a hoop, if you'll pardon the pun, and would be back at Wembley at the end of the season to win the Cup again against QPR. Those Spurs fans at school who were allowed to go to matches were licking their lips at the prospect of mauling the newly promoted Hammers. Mike Morris, for one, covered his exercise books in anti-West Ham graffiti for weeks before the game, saying we'd get slaughtered. Spurs were on top form and would be parading the cup before the game. Bye-bye West Ham. I prayed that we would get something out of the game, if only to keep Morris reasonably quiet, but I got more than I could possibly have hoped for. 1-0 up at half-time, West Ham must have smelled blood, because they ripped Spurs to shreds in the second half, winning 4-0, with David Cross scoring all 4 goals. The feeling of smug satisfaction I gained as I walked into Double French on the Thursday morning was unbelievable. I hadn't felt anything like it before. Up to that point, it had always been personal. Triumphs had been shared with friends, but we had never suffered abuse or even doubt before a game to make the taste of victory that much sweeter. I took up my seat next to Morris, who had an angry look on his face. He'd been to the game. He wasn't happy. "Did they parade the cup before the game, Mike?" I asked. "Yes, of course," he said down his nose. "Oh well, you got that bit right then." "Shut up. I never said anything." "You were going to." 4-0, I said. I said the words slowly, savouring each one as though it were a piece of Turkish delight smothered in icing sugar. I saw his fist move, just as our French teacher interjected, "Now then, boys." I spent the rest of the lesson scribbling 4-0 on my exercise book in a million different fonts and showing it to Mike Morris. 1981 was a funny year. Funny strange, not funny ha-ha. I use football matches to assimilate what was happening in my life and in the world, and it helps me greatly to remember where I was at any given time, what records were in the charts, and what was happening in the news. On that day, Thursday the 3rd of September 1981, I remember the first lesson of the day so clearly it could have been this morning. It was followed by religious education, in which we were set the task of writing an essay on why Bobby Sands, the IRA hunger striker, had died. It was too tempting to put, because he didn't eat anything for 3 months, or because he was a prat. I wrote a page of what I thought the teacher would want to read, political struggle in Ulster, dying for his beliefs, etc. That was always the best thing to do in RE, and as I later found in sociology, speaking your mind rarely gets good results in exam marks. Two-Tone was in. I think the specials had just been knocked off the number 1 spot with Ghost Town, but in our class there was only one band to be interested in, and that was Duran Duran. This was not because we liked the music particularly, but because there was a boy in the class called Michael Durrani. He only had to walk in the room to be met by a chorus of "Girls on Film." He hated it, which was why we did it even more. Children are more cruel than any other creature in the world, and that is a fact. It was getting serious now. The following year I got a paper round and started earning the princely sum of £5.70 a week. That was good money in 1982, and apart from the benefits of never being late for school, I was able to read the sports pages of every newspaper in the shop before setting off, and every sports magazine too, if the lad setting up was a bit slow. The lad setting up was Richard Pusey. I was dead jealous of him because he was a Chelsea fan and went to every game home and away with his older brother. At that time, Chelsea languished in the old second division, a fact which I lost no time in pointing out to him, but he would always talk about the great adventures he'd had travelling around the country following the Blues. He was a year older than me and had already seen West Ham on more occasions than I had, and he didn't even support them. Something had to be done about it. Passive support had been going on for too long. A year of nagging finally succeeded. 1983-84 was the start of the great adventure.